I was very honoured to be asked to present the annual David Fleeman Lecture for the Dr. Johnson Society of Australia. For those of you unable to be at the lecture in Melbourne, I do hope that you enjoy this recorded version of the talk. A clean shirt for the ladies, Dr. Johnson and the women of Scotland. If I had no duties and no reference to futurity, I would spend my life in a post-chaise with a pretty woman, but she should be one who could understand me and would add something to the conversation. As this wonderful quote illustrates, Samuel Johnson loved the society of women, women who were attractive physically, women who could hold their own in conversation, and women who looked after him personally. He liked feminine company, praised the writing and actively promoted the careers of women writers, as in the cases of Fanny Burney, Charlotte Lennox, Elizabeth Carter, Hannah More, and Frances Reynolds. He shared his home with women, as with Anna Williams and Mrs. Desmoulins, and he visited women, spending months together at the home of his beloved Hester Thrale. Frances Reynolds, sister of the famous painter, commented that Johnson placed a higher value on female friendship than perhaps he did on male friendship. On the 3rd of August 1773, Johnson sent Boswell a note. "Dear Sir, I shall set out from London on Friday the 6th of this month, and purpose not to loiter much by the way." When Dr. Johnson set off for Scotland, where he intended to travel around the countryside with his friend James Boswell, he was more interested in the men and women he would meet there than he was in Scottish scenery. Possibly this was due to his poor sight, but Johnson had always been more intrigued by his fellow human beings than he'd ever been by rocks and mountains, glens and waterfalls. It was people who interested him, and in going to Scotland, he hoped to be introduced to a wide variety of people of high and low degree, of different lifestyles and habits, and of course, of different sexes. He was in his 64th year, hard of hearing, weak-sighted, with an ungainly, convulsing body, and yet his fascination for his own species led him to make this arduous journey. There would not be the comfort of travelling in a post-chaise with a pretty woman by his side. Rather, there were horses, Highland ponies, his own feet, and a variety of boats that would carry him on his way, with only the occasional chaise. And yet women, pretty or otherwise, were encountered, and they form an interesting facet of his memorable travels. Johnson arrived in Edinburgh on Saturday, 14th of August, 1773, and made his way to Boyd's Inn on the corner of Canongate and St. Mary's Wynd. The inn no longer exists, although a plaque marks the spot. It's just around the corner from the Canongate Church and from one of my favourite statues of any writer, the poet Robert Fergusson, who was to die in poverty and madness in the year after Johnson's visit. It's unlikely that Johnson had ever heard of Fergusson, but he'd surely have sympathised with the young man's struggles to earn money from literature and to fight off melancholia. Johnson sent word to Boswell of his arrival, and while he waited, called for lemonade in the crowded and confused inn. One sip told him it was not sweet enough, and when he asked the waiter to add sugar, the man used his greasy fingers to drop another lump into the drink. Furious, Johnson threw the mixture out the window. It was not a propitious beginning to his trip, and when Boswell arrived, Johnson was delighted to accept his friend's offer of accommodation. They set off for Boswell's house in St. James's Court in the Lawn Market. "Shall I see your lady?" asked Johnson. "Yes." "Then I'll put on a clean shirt." "'Tis needless," replied Boswell. "Either don't see her tonight or don't put on a clean shirt." But Johnson knew what was required. He must meet his hostess, and he must be dressed in a clean shirt. "Sir, I'll do both." he told Boswell firmly. Arm in arm, the friends walked up the High Street, one of the great thoroughfares of this world, packed with literary associations. It's hard for us to imagine what that walk must have been like for the two men. No street lamps, foul gutters, and the risk of pickpockets. But did Johnson's clean shirt remain clean throughout this walk? In his delightful book, Footnotes, A Journey Around Britain in the Company of Great Writers, Peter Fiennes states that, quote, the evening effluvia was tipped over them both as they walked, meaning that the contents of chamber pots, which traditionally in Edinburgh were simply hurled from windows with the cry of "Gardy Lou," landed on the friends. Fiennes tells his readers that Johnson arrived to meet Mrs. Boswell twitching, sodden, reeking. Boswell certainly informs us that Johnson was assailed by the evening effluvia of Edinburgh and announced to Boswell that he could smell him in the dark. Effluvia, however, can be discharge or odours. I suspect that Fiennes has got it wrong, and that Johnson did not arrive wet from the foul contents of a chamber pot, but merely smelling generally of the stink of the city. Margaret Boswell was waiting to serve her distinguished guests some tea, her husband having warned her that his friend was a shameless and hardened tea drinker. And she was soon charmed by his conversation into forgetting whatever smells he brought in with him. She and Boswell, who was her cousin as well as her husband, had been married 4 years before, and she had a small daughter, Veronica, only a few months old. Her health had been uncertain since the birth of a son who had died. It was probably not a convenient time for her to be up late with guests and worrying about Johnson's comfort. Probably also she felt some underlying resentment against the man who had so often drawn her husband from her side to make costly trips to London. Boswell's father hadn't wanted him to marry Margaret Montgomery. She was 2 years older than her husband and brought no money into the marriage. But Margaret loved her Jamie and made him a stable, devoted and soothing wife. They had moved to St. James's Court in 1771 and taken a 3rd-floor flat, owned and rented to them by David Hume. 2 years later, just before Johnson's visit, they took a larger apartment downstairs, so had 2 floors, an internal stair, 4 bedrooms, and 2 genteel, well-finished public rooms, each above 18 feet long, with marble chimney pieces. The flat is now gone, but again a plaque marks the Boswells' residence in this part of the city. Margaret was understandably nervous about meeting the great Dr. Johnson, but Johnson admired her drawing room, thanked her for her attentiveness over his many cups of tea, and when she went off to bed, he happily stayed up until 2 a.m. chatting with Boswell. Johnson decided that Margaret was, quote, in a proper degree inferior to her husband, but I think he underestimated her. Margaret was clever and well-informed, patient and forgiving, and it's hard to imagine any woman making a more understanding wife to a very difficult husband. Probably the poor woman was awed into silence by her distinguished and eccentric visitor. During Johnson's time in the capital city, he seems to have met mainly men. Distinguished gentlemen came to call and pay their respects, although the Duchess of Douglas was one female visitor. He himself wrote nothing of his time in Edinburgh at the start of the journey. The city failed to greatly impress him and reminded him of Birmingham's Old Town. Margaret Boswell gave up her own bedchamber to his comfort. She poured endless cups of tea for Johnson and for those who rushed to meet him, and she tried not to complain when he tilted candles, the better to see what he was reading, and as a result spilled wax on her new carpets. I wonder if any other clean shirts were put on during the visit, or did he wear the same one each day? When they set off on 18th of August, she sent clean sheets with them in case those they found in inns were filthy. And in his absence, she even took care of his 2 pistols. He'd heard alarming reports of the dangers of Scottish travel in London, but by this time had decided that the place was safer than he had expected and that he could manage without weapons. Then Margaret Boswell waved them goodbye with a great deal of relief. Now, Edinburgh had given Johnson the chance to meet educated, literate, and well-spoken women. St Andrews offered him someone much further down the social scale. Her name was Mrs. Bruce, and she lived in the ruins of the vault of the cathedral of the city. She was the widow of a man whose family had lived in the vault for 4 generations, so she claimed a hereditary residence in the place. This ancient claim fascinated Johnson. Convinced she was allied to Scottish royalty, she told Boswell that when quality visited, they always took notice of her. Probably this was a broad hint for a financial gift. Mrs. Bruce lived with her cat, and Johnson always had a soft spot for felines. He noted her living conditions with interest. Her habitation contained all that she had. Her turf was laid in one place, and her balls of coal dust in another, but her bed seemed to be clean. Mrs. Bruce worked at spinning and was troublesome to nobody. Johnson was introduced to members of the university faculty while in the city, but old Mrs. Bruce seems to have interested him just as much. This is one lady who would not have minded his lack of a clean shirt. Living in a ruin, she herself must have struggled ever to wash a garment or herself. What a cold, hard life poor Mrs. Bruce must have had. Boswell and Johnson made their way north. He was recognised by a woman at the English chapel in Aberdeen, and she informed the Earl of Errol of the famous lexicographer's arrival. As a result, Johnson was invited to Slains Castle, traditional home of the Errols, premier earls of Scotland. Johnson thought the castle, which seemed only a continuation of a perpendicular rock, must have been a terrific place to watch a storm. There must have been many such storms as he wished for over the centuries since, and today the castle is crumbling into ruin. The Countess of Errol seems to have been a forceful woman. She refused to let her guests leave until they had seen 2 places on the coast, Dunbuy and the Bullers of Buchan, and so hence they were conducted. Johnson was not much impressed by the first. Dunbuy, or Yellow Rock, is a large rock covered with the droppings of coots. But the Buller was a sight which no man can see with indifference. It's a collapsed sea cave, forming an almost circular chasm, and the sea rushes in through a natural archway, boiling ferociously. Johnson made a perilous walk around its rim, a highly dangerous thing to do for a man with seriously poor sight. Surely the bossy countess did not recommend such a walk to him. If she did give such advice, she could well have been responsible for his untimely death had he had one slip or stumble. It was at the side of Loch Ness that the men had one of their most memorable female encounters, and one that can be considered slightly disturbing today. Making their way along the water's edge, they passed a traditional hovel, a construction known as a black house, and Boswell thought it would be amusing for his friend to see the interior. In they walked. The woman who was its occupant spoke almost no English. Boswell refers to her as an old woman, but she can't have been exactly elderly. She was married to a man in his 80s, but she had 5 children, the eldest of whom was 13. Her hovel was made of mud and stones, with one hole in the roof and another in the wall. Johnson states firmly that to enter a habitation without leave seems to be not considered here as rudeness or intrusion, but surely they gave a terrible fright to the woman inside. Here they found her boiling up a pot of goat's flesh. She kept goats and poultry and grew potatoes and barley. She offered her unexpected visitors whiskey, begged them for some snuff, and then probably felt that the laws of hospitality had been satisfied. But Boswell insisted on seeing her bedroom. In spite of her strong protests, he picked up a lighted taper and barged in. Now, 27 years before, one of the Duke of Cumberland's officers had murdered a woman living in that very same hovel when she tried to stop him raping her daughter. Boswell joked with Johnson about the woman fearing that they wanted to have sex with her, a joke in very poor taste when you consider her home's history. What would the Me Too movement have to say about such very aggressive masculinity today? Johnson noted local women as he travelled, barefooted girls in plenty. Scotland, of course, is not a good climate for going without shoes. He noted women begging, women preparing for emigration with their families, and women in inns who served him food and drink. In one establishment, the landlady appeared to have heard of him and gushed, "It is a pleasure to have such a man in one's house." But she remained convinced that he was a medical doctor who might be able to give her some health advice. One landlord's daughter in the Highlands greatly pleased him. Some time after dinner, we were surprised by the entrance of a young woman, not inelegant either in mien or dress, who asked us whether we would have tea. We found that she was the daughter of our host and desired her to make it. Her conversation, like her appearance, was pleasing. We knew that the girls of the Highlands are all gentlewomen and treated her with great respect, which she received as customary and due, and was neither elated by it nor confused, but repaid my civilities without embarrassment and told me how much I honoured her country by coming to survey it. Johnson presented the young woman with a book which he happened to have on him. The book was Edward Cocker's Arithmetic, which he had just been reading. Goodness only knows what the lassie made of that present, even though she had been to school in Inverness. Walking through the valley of Glen Shiel, Johnson was given a drink of milk by one local woman, and in return he distributed largesse of tobacco and various halfpence to those in the neighbourhood, as well as paying her ½ crown for the milk. Although told she probably owned a dozen cows, he was unwilling to accept freebies when there was such general poverty. He was impressed by the good looks of the women on the Isle of Skye, in spite of the ravages that a harsh climate tends to inflict on a complexion. The ladies have as much beauty here as in other places, but bloom and softness are not to be expected among the lower classes, whose faces are exposed to the rudeness of the climate, and whose features are sometimes contracted by want and sometimes hardened by blasts. It was a tough life for the poor in such a place. Women here, he concluded, study to be either pleasing or useful. Their deficiencies are seldom supplied by very liberal fortunes. He was welcomed onto the sands of Skye by Sir Alexander MacDonald, who escorted him to the MacDonald seat of Armadale on the south tip of the island. Johnson ate his dinner that night to the accompaniment of bagpipes, which one rather imagines impeded his delight in dinner-table conversation. He found Sir Alexander boorish company. His host's wife, Elizabeth, was a beautiful woman. She had been Miss Boswell of Yorkshire before her marriage, but she was not the sort of pretty woman he'd have invited into that imagined post-chaise. "She is so dull, so heavy," he complained to Boswell, memorably insisting that this woman would sink a 90-gun ship and was, quote, cut out of cabbage. It also annoyed him that she was parsimonious and lacked the common decencies of her tea table. No claret was served, and the food was ill-dressed. Her clothes, in his view, were more suited to a maidservant's. He could not forget her dullness, and later in the trip mimicked her as insipidity on a monument grinning at sense and spirit, and told Boswell that the difference between that woman when alive and when she shall be dead is only this: when alive, she calls for beer. When dead, she'll call for beer no longer. Poor woman, compared to a cabbage, she has gone down in history condemned for dullness and speech by the great Dr. Johnson. A melancholy fate indeed. Next, the travellers made their way by boat to Rasay, the island between Skye and the mainland. There, thanks to the laird, whose family had owned the island for over 400 years, he enjoyed much more acceptable hospitality and all the marks of improved life. There was a good dinner, a little ball, the laird had 10 daughters at Rasay House, and all of this made Johnson feel much more in harmony with the world. It was after that he made his famous visit to Dunvegan Castle, seat of Clan MacLeod, a visit that is commemorated there to this day by his portrait and his letter of thanks. Once again, I suspect he made an exhausting visitor for poor Lady MacLeod. After she had served him 16 dishes of tea, she had the temerity to suggest that a basin would save him trouble. Johnson was not pleased. "I wonder, madam, why all the ladies ask me such impertinent questions. It is to save yourselves trouble and not me." When she remarked that living in such an ancient castle was inconvenient, he rebuked her further and told her to keep to the rock. Lady MacLeod, not to be shamed into silence, told Johnson and Boswell that it was easy for them to talk. They did not have to live in a draughty, cold castle full of stairs and dungeons and with no garden for her to enjoy. Lady MacLeod had lived many years in England and knew all the arts of southern elegance, but Johnson remained convinced that she should be satisfied with life in the oldest inhabited castle in Scotland. Johnson was unwell at Dunvegan, and Lady MacLeod, who thought him a very ugly man, saw him in his sick bed when she delivered the endless cups of tea. His wig was on inside out because of the cold, and when she tried to coax him into taking a medicinal brandy, he snapped that he could not take drink in moderation. He slept in the famous fairy room, but no one thought to show him the legendary fairy flag, and this is now all that's left of it, during his visit. He shocked his hostess by telling her men and women had no more natural goodness than wolves. By the time he left the castle, maybe Lady MacLeod felt that some strange kind of wolf had taken up residence in her rugged abode. I hope there was a reasonable supply of clean shirts brought out during the visit, for cleanliness was on his mind. He announced to Boswell, "I have often thought that if I kept a seraglio, the ladies should all wear linen gowns or cotton, stuffs made of vegetable substance. I would have no silk. You cannot tell when it is clean." Boswell laughed at Johnson's idea of a harem. He himself couldn't have cared less what material clothed female bodies. It was getting the clothes removed that was his primary concern. It was on Skye that a married girl of 16 went and sat on his knee for a bet and kissed him. Her friends, noting his fearsome appearance, had insisted that he was too ugly to kiss. Johnson was delighted by her temerity. "Do it again and let us see who will tire first," he offered. Happily, he bounced her on his knee for some time before she returned victorious to her friends. Flora MacDonald, by the time of Johnson's visit, had become a part of the legends of the Highlands, thanks to her rescue of bonny Prince Charlie. Dr. Johnson was eager to meet Flora, and at her home in Kingsborough, he even got to sleep in the bed where that ill-fated prince had slumbered. "I have had no ambitious thoughts in it," he concluded sadly, and was relieved that he was not using the same sheets upon which the prince had rested. Those were kept carefully by Flora, and she is said to have been buried in them. Flora poured tea, and he found her a little woman of a mild and genteel appearance, mighty soft and well-bred. Poor Flora and her husband were actually in dire financial straits and were soon to emigrate to America, and yet she served Johnson turkey, porter, claret, and punch during his visit. Cole is a barren island in the Inner Hebrides. On Cole, Johnson met Mrs. McSwain, who spoke no English and stirred his tea with a spoon made from horn. On Mull, things were more civilised, and a Miss McLean had, he found, been educated in Glasgow and had taught herself Erse. On Iona, he visited the nuns' cemetery and the ruins of the nunnery, and at Moy he was the guest of the Laird of Lochbuie and his wife. She offered Johnson cold sheep's head for his breakfast. He refused it with anger and surprise. The tiny island of Inchkenneth is today best remembered for its connection with the notorious Mitfords. What would Johnson have made of that collection of sisters? I should think he'd have loved tossing and goring in conversation with Nancy. She'd have held her own magnificently. But it was Lady Redesdale, mother of the Mitfords, and her damaged daughter Unity, who lived on Inchkenneth. Unity, a passionate admirer of Hitler, had tried to shoot herself and left a bullet in her brain as a result. On the island, Johnson's host was Sir Alan MacLean and his wife Anne. There were 3 daughters, Maria, Sibella, and Anne, but the family had no male heir. Johnson was warmed by their hospitality. He dined on Scotch broth, roasted kid, venison and beef collops, and after dinner one of the girls played the harpsichord as Boswell danced with another. The next day, one of these accomplished girls read the English service at church. Inverary Castle was home to the Duke of Argyll and his Duchess. This was definitely an occasion for another of those clean shirts, for Elizabeth, the Duchess, had once been one of the famous Irish Gunning sisters who had all made brilliant marriages. Her first marriage had made her Duchess of Hamilton, and now she ruled over another castle as Duchess of Argyll. There was past family history between her and Boswell. He had been involved in a case against her Hamilton husband, and he was most anxious about this visit, fearing he'd be excluded altogether. He wasn't, but the Duchess studiously and coldly ignored him, while being most charming to Dr. Johnson and hanging on his every word. Inverary Castle was in the process of being completed at the time of the visit, and Johnson and Boswell stayed for 2 days. Here, Johnson was on his best behaviour. In his note of thanks, he said he had been honoured by the Duchess, and she pointedly sent him her compliments while ignoring poor Boswell. Lady Susanna Eglintoune in Ayrshire near Auchinleck was a member of the House of Kennedy. In her 85th year, with bright blue eyes, amiable and accomplished, she felt she was old enough to take whatever freedoms she wished. Having told Johnson she was old enough to be his mother, she even called him son and embraced him. That's a sight I'd have liked to witness. And finally, after 83 days after leaving the capital, after all the inns and castles, duchesses, landladies and serving wenches, it was back to Edinburgh and Mrs. Boswell, who might have been relieved to see her Jamie, but was not so delighted to see the bear-like man she felt always led him around. Once again, she was most assiduous and respectful in her attentions to Johnson, but his uncouth habits grated. His clumsiness disturbed her, and his irregular hours did not suit a woman with a new baby in the house. His habit of drumming his feet up and down when seated probably drove her to distraction. Johnson was all too aware that he gave her trouble enough. He went out and about a bit more this time and, interestingly, visited a school for the deaf, where girls were educated along with boys. Founded in 1760 by Thomas Braidwood, it is believed to be the very first school for the deaf in Britain. Johnson wrote a question on a young lady's slate, and she was able to do the sum he had set her, which greatly pleased him. Johnson had been urged by an eccentric judge and author named Sir John Dalrymple to visit him on his way out of Edinburgh. Sir John had spoken publicly of his rather low opinion of Johnson, so Boswell decided to accompany his friend to make sure all went smoothly. Johnson said his farewell to Margaret Boswell, who must have waved him off with relief. The two men arrived late at the Cranston home of Sir John and Lady Elizabeth Dalrymple and their 13 children in Midlothian, for what had been promised as a feast of sheep's head. By the time they arrived, Sir John was annoyed and the dinner was not a success. The rooms were icy and the conversation poor. Johnson was not tempted to prolong his visit, but there was still breakfast to be faced the next morning. It did not include any of the Scottish food Johnson had come to enjoy. Sir John Dalrymple offered him either a foreleg or a hind leg of mutton. The foreleg meant the shoulder, and Johnson voted for the hind leg, which it seems was what Sir John was particularly partial to for himself. Poor Lady Dalrymple was left much disconcerted, uncertain whether to please her husband or her guest. But Johnson failed to understand her dilemma and disliked all the offerings of her table. "Sir," he grouched to his friend afterwards, "this is an odious woman." And later he added, "Were I Dalrymple, I'd go and entertain my friends at Edinburgh and leave her to herself. Did you observe when we voted leg? Sir, she looked as if we had voted for roasting one of her children." The chosen hind leg was to be served cold, a most unappetizing breakfast. Johnson and Boswell did not linger, but scurried off to a nearby inn at Black Shields for the evening. They breakfasted together the next morning, and then Johnson boarded a post-chaise for London, leaving Boswell to reflect with great pleasure on a tour which has been the means of preserving so much of the enlightened and instructive conversation of one whose virtues will, I hope, ever be an object of imitation, and whose powers of mind were so extraordinary that ages may revolve before such a man shall appear. There was one woman who was a continual presence on the famous journey through Scotland. She was not physically there, but was very much there in spirit, and that was Hester Thrale. Boswell regarded her in the light of a rival for Johnson's attention, and was jealous of the times his friend spent at Streatham with the Thrales. He unhappily noted the many letters posted to Hester during the journey. She had urged Johnson to undertake the trip, but Boswell was not grateful and noted dispiritedly that Mrs. Thrale's enchantment over him seldom failed. Indeed, he said, she all but travelled with them as a sort of saint about whom no levity was allowed. When Johnson got back to the comforts of Streatham, he no doubt told Hester that no woman in Scotland could come close to her in conversation, careful attention, and the pouring of endless cups of tea. The great journey came to an end. Johnson thanked his friend and sent compliments to Boswell's wife. "I know Mrs. Boswell wished me well to go," he confided, Her wishes have not been disappointed. She is a sweet lady, only she was so glad to see me go that I have almost a mind to come again, that she may have the same pleasure." Johnson loved to tease, but Margaret Boswell was spared another visit by Johnson and never saw him again. As she handed him back his pistols, was she tempted to use them, one wonders? Throughout the trip, Johnson drank toasts, including at least one with whisky, a drink he tried for the first time while in Scotland, toasts to the various ladies they had encountered. This had been his first ever journey outside of England. He noted the good looks, or lack thereof, of Scottish women. He noted their clothes. Hester Thrale commented on how observant Johnson tended to be about the niceties of female dress. He smiled approvingly as they poured him tea, and he castigated them when he thought it necessary. Johnson liked to take flattering notice of women and to talk to them. With Scottish women, he pronounced upon female chastity, the Act of Union, the lack of trees in Scotland, and much else. Dr. Samuel Johnson loved to be an authority and to hold forth in whatever company he found himself. It would have been fascinating to have more detailed accounts or diary entries or letters giving the female point of view of the Scottish women who met him, entertained him, and who were or were not privileged to see him in one of those clean shirts. On arriving home, he sent a letter to Boswell, the man who had patiently guided and accompanied him and made the whole expedition possible. "Dear Sir, I came home last night without any incommodity, danger, or weariness, and am ready to begin a new journey." No doubt to the huge relief of Mrs. Boswell, it was Wales that drew him in 1774, not Scotland. But it has not been reported how many clean shirts he took with him to impress the Welsh ladies. When Johnson's Journey to the Western Islands was published in 1775, he gained a new female admirer, the Queen. The king, entranced by the book, read passages aloud to his wife, but the Queen would not stay to get the king's book and got hold of a copy of her own. In 1698, a remarkable woman traveller, Celia Fiennes, made her great journey around England, but she refused to venture into Scotland without an armed guard. She had heard the food was inedible, the habitations filthy, and the manners frightening. 75 years later, Dr. Johnson bravely went where the indomitable Celia had feared to go. As a boy, he had read a description of the Western Islands by Martin Martin. The result of a tour Martin, who was a native of Skye, took around 1695. That book, first published in 1703, had given Johnson a dream of going to Scotland himself, but it took Boswell bouncing into his life to turn that dream into a reality. In 1769 and 1772, Thomas Pennant published his Travels to the Highlands, further inspiration for Johnson and Boswell's famous journey. Dr. Samuel Johnson saw some of Britain's last untamed wilderness. He found that the road that led to England was perhaps not the most glorious sight a Scot ever saw, and he saw and learned much to interest and to educate him. The women of Scotland had, on the whole, impressed him. Surely they well deserved that clean shirt that he felt he must wear in their honour. Thank you very much.